Well, how about historically? Have Christians ever embraced capitalism?
This is a tough question, and it occurred to me that a lot of people probably don't ask this question unless they study Christian history, because if you study the history of Christian theology, what you discover is that there's a period of about 15 centuries in which all Christians, first Catholics and then Catholics and Orthodox, and later Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox, said that lending money for interest was intrinsically wrong. It was this sin called usury. And in fact, Luther, even after the Reformation, was convinced of this. People have often thought, and Christians think, well, this seems to be based on Scripture. And this is certainly what early Christians thought, because the Bible does speak about lending and interest. In Leviticus, the Hebrews are commanded not to lend interest to their fellow Israelites. What's interesting, though, is that in the book of Deuteronomy, the command is you can't lend it interest to your fellow Israelites, but you can lend it interest to people outside your community, to foreigners that are someplace else. Now, we didn't often really notice that, though, and then, of course, you go to the New Testament. It doesn't talk about usury, per se, but you do get things like Jesus in Luke 6, who says, that you should lend expecting nothing in return. And so people took those passages of Scripture in Christian theology, and they connected it with an argument by the Greek philosopher Aristotle about the nature of money. And here's Aristotle's basic argument. He essentially said, it's legitimate to charge someone for, say, selling them a cow or selling them a pineapple because it's fecund, right? It has value, it grew. If you had a cow, you could milk it and things like that. Money, on the other hand, is not fecund, it's not fertile, it's sterile, it's just a unit of exchange. And so Aristotle thought, okay, if you charge somebody just for a money loan, you're essentially charging them for nothing of value. It's a valueless thing. It's like you're charging them not for a yard of cloth, you're charging them for a yard, right? It's not actually a thing. It doesn't have value. And so what happened, and it's a complicated story that I discuss in the book of how the usury debate finally got settled, but the sort of gist of it was that Christians learned to distinguish between the biblical text and what they said and Aristotle's argument about the nature of money. Because what happened is it became very obvious that Aristotle's argument just doesn't hold water, at least in a modern context, because in a modern economy with a banking system, a business loan, if I'm a bank and I give somebody a $100,000 loan, right, and I charge them interest for it, I'm charging them for something, right? I'm charging them because I have a risk that I bear because I gave the loan, and the opportunity cost I give up by giving them the money rather than using it for some other use. And so you're actually charging for something when you give that kind of loan. The other thing about Aristotle's argument, he assumed money was sterile. But we, of course, know. I mean, a capital loan, a business loan, can be quite fertile. A loan to start a business that's successful can actually lead to the creation of more wealth and more jobs. So at least in certain contexts, we now understand money is fertile rather than sterile. And so then the question is, okay, what do we do as Christians with the biblical texts? Well, we don't do anything with them. We don't try to toss them out. We look at them carefully. And when you do that, what you discover is this crucial distinction in the Old Testament, from Leviticus to Deuteronomy, between Israelites lending and charging interest to each other. Remember, they were told that they could charge others interest. So what that meant is that clearly charging interest wasn't intrinsically evil. It was just, it was wrong for Israelites to do it amongst themselves. Now, why is that? Well, we have a hard time thinking about tribal cultures. But of course, ancient Israel is a tribal culture. And so somebody's charging their fellow Israelite interest. They're basically probably charging their brother or first cousin or fellow tribesman. So they're essentially taking a family relationship and turning it into a commercial relationship. And so really in the Old Testament, the command is essentially that. Don't treat a family relationship as if it's an ordinary business relationship. Jesus' statement, if you look at it carefully, he says, when you lend, expect nothing in return. He actually doesn't say anything about interest. What's he talking about? Is he saying, well, banks should just give out money and not, expect to ever see it again? Well, no. Jesus also said, if someone asks you for your shirt, give them your coat also. He wasn't saying it was wrong for people to sell coats, right? Obviously, clothing merchants can have a legitimate business. What he was saying is that he's encouraging his followers to be generous, so that when we're generous and we lend someone something, right, we don't fixate on it and we don't expect ever to have it returned. He was encouraging generosity. He wasn't actually saying anything about interest in bank loans. And that's kind of a long story, but that's a complicated backstory to Christian theology. And so that's why now we accept the legitimacy, and Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestant Christians all accept the legitimacy of charging interest. What's interesting, though, as a result of the financial crisis in 2008, there were actually some Christian scholars who called for Christians to reconsider Islamic forms of banking. Now, in Islam, they've never resolved this question the way we have in the Christian world with respect to interest, and so it's still officially illegal to charge interest in Islam. This, to me, was a kind of striking claim, and I heard this from several Christian leaders, and so I realized, okay, that's seriously throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We need to get clear on the nature of interest in money loans if we're not going to make some kind of severe mistake.